What's up, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Officer Training School. My name is Joushi Howard, and today we're going to be talking about the different kinds of heavy weapon squads and how you can potentially include them in your list, what makes them good, and how can you make them even better. So let's start with, as always, with our lesson plan. We're going to be talking about the basics of heavy weapon squads, whether to take indirect versus direct fire versions of them, orders and stratagems you can use on them, and then lastly, we'll go ahead and talk about the strategy on how to actually use these, a couple of tips and tricks and ways to make sure you can get the most out of these units. So to start off with, heavy weapon squads are infantry with both a big upside and a big downside. The big upside is, of course, that they have a big honking gun, right? You get to include a mortar or a las cannon or a super heavy flamer. The downside being that they don't take up quite as much space, so they're not as effective at screening as a lot of other units that we can potentially take, and they also just don't have as much OC. So it's not like this unit is entirely upside as compared to what we're looking at with a lot of our battle line units like Cadian Shock Troops or Catachan Jungle Fighters. However, one of the other things heavy weapon squads do that our other units can't do in the same way is heavy weapon squads help to control space in a massive way. Our mortars will help us control space by removing their screens, as well as controlling our own backfield by serving as screens to prevent any rapid ingresses or deep strike from coming into our side of the board. And the flamers that we generally take on the Kree heavy weapon squads control space because they are an incredible Overwatch threat at 18-inch range. So let's talk a little bit so let's take a moment to talk about the difference between taking these as direct firing units as opposed to indirect fire. And we'll go ahead and say this right now, that if you have an option to take the indirect fire version of a heavy weapon squad, you should pretty much always be doing that, at least in 10th edition. Indirect fire generally is going to screen the backfield, and it has the upside of shooting at their little pieces over the course of the entire game, which is why you would generally spend similar points on a mortar, as opposed to those exact same points on a unit that is only there to screen your backfield. The one exception to this is, of course, Cadian Shock Troops, because Cadian Shock Troops have sticky, and so you can't just shoot them off of our backfield in the same way that you can with mortars. It makes us a little bit more resilient to their indirect. It makes us more resilient to their shooting deep strike units. It also has the upside of attaching to Ursula Creed and Cadian Command Squads. But the other major thing to think about is that direct fire options just don't do that much damage. They're going to be doing less damage than spending an equivalent number of points on other units, and they tend to just die, unlike spending the exact same amount of points on, say, an Armored Sentinel, or instead of taking 3 heavy weapon squads that are direct firing on a Lehman Russ. They just really, unfortunately, don't do anything better than everything else that we could potentially take for similar amounts of points. Now, I do want to say that it's not like mortars really are going to be doing that much damage either. However, if you were to spend the points on getting a Catachan Mortar Squad, as opposed to a Catachan Jungle Fighters, the Catachan Jungle Fighters, if they're only there to screen out your backfield, are doing 0 damage. So anything more that we can do with these mortars is going to help out. And in a lot of matchups, one unit of 3 mortars is going to kill about 1 Marine or about 3 Guardsmen per turn. And we have some ways to make this a little bit better in Bridgehead and Siege Regiment, but in general, it's going to take these units of mortars about 3 turns to earn their points back. The upside is that they probably will get their points back as long as you're shooting them every single turn of the game. The flip side to this, though, is direct fire versions of these units don't really get their points back. They just don't really do a lot of damage. And they're definitely paying for the price of the fact that mortars happen at different points of the edition pretty effective. So in general, you don't really have much of a reason to take direct fire versions of heavy weapon squads if you have an option to take the indirect. The other thing about this is you should never be taking Cadian heavy weapon squads. The Overwatch rule that they have is completely irrelevant, because you should always have something in your list that is a better Overwatch tool. Oftentimes it's going to be things like Hellhounds or Krieg Flamers, or could be tanks like Lehman Russ Battle Tanks or the Rogel Dorn. If you have one of these things in your list, why are you spending the CP to Overwatch with the Cadian Heavy Weapon Squad when you could just do it with something that is going to actually do damage? The other thing here is that a Cadian Heavy Weapon Squad costs the same as a Catachan Heavy Weapon Squad, so you should never be considering the Cadians, because Catachan has a better rule in terms of rerolling hits and wounds of 1 against monsters and vehicles, and the Catachan one has Scout 6. So in matchups where they aren't as useful for being mortars, they are useful because they are relatively quick. They have an entire extra turn of movement as compared to Cadian Heavy Weapon Squad. So with that in mind, if you're taking Cadian or Catachan Heavy Weapon Squads, it should almost always be mortars. And if you're taking the Krieg Heavy Weapon Squad, it should basically always be the Heavy Flamer. The Stubber does absolutely no damage, and the las cannons are just really inefficient and really inconsistent. But if you want to take the Krieg heavy weapon squad las cannons, then you should look to taking the Catachan heavy las cannons. Let's talk about the orders and stratagems. This section will be relatively quick because we don't use them that much on these units, and there's not that many good options to do. The first one is move, move, move. You're oftentimes going to be using these on Krieg heavy flamers in particular, since they have a base move of only 4 inches, so that +3 can help them move over a lot of terrain pieces and actually get them to places on the board where they need to be. Also, use them on Catachan mortars when they don't have good targets otherwise. The other one is going to be take aim. If you have mortars, you generally want to get a little bit of extra firepower out of them, so you should have some kind of regiment order somewhere in your list. This is easy to get with someone like Ursula Creed, especially if you give them the Master Vox, so they can order pretty much anywhere into your own side of the board in order to make sure they have take aim. In terms of stratagems, the main one that you're doing is going to be Overwatch. Not with the Cadians. Again, I cannot stress enough how useless the Cadian heavy weapon squad really is. But it is very powerful to do it with the Krieg heavy flamers, because they have super nasty Overwatch at an 18-inch range at 512. Means you're basically just getting an entire another activation out of this unit. In terms of other stratagems you do on heavy weapon squads, they're really inconsistent. Grenade is pretty cool, but everything else is just really situational. You know, if you're using them to try and take away an objective, the Inspired Command can be very useful. Tanglefoot grenades and recon is nice. Rapid Dispersal is actually pretty common because Krieg heavy flamers in particular, you do see a lot in mechanized. And Reinforcements, of course, is good on Krieg flamers. So one strategy that I have seen people talk about that I'm just going to nip in the bud right now is the Catachan scouting las cannons. So the basic way this works is you take the Catachan heavy weapon squad, you scout them 6, and then on turn 1, because the scout happens before turn 1, you remain stationary in order to benefit from heavy. You give them take aim, and now you're going to have 3 las cannons hitting on 3s, rerolling hits and wounds of 1 against vehicles and monsters. This strategy is bad. I'll just say right now that when these units were only 50 points, I spent about 3 games trying to make this work in Bridgehead. And there are several problems with this strategy. The first one is it relies on going first. Because if you go second, you can't actually use this, because if you use the scout in order to move your Catachan heavy weapon squad into the open, your opponent's just going to kill them, basically for free. The second thing is, even if you do go first, you don't even kill anything reliably. One unit of Catachan las cannons has about a 27% chance to kill a rhino. And that is a rhino that is not in cover. If that rhino is in cover, it goes down to a little bit less than 20%. The third problem is, if you are trying to kill that unit, if your Catachan las cannons can shoot that rhino, it means you can shoot it with a Lehman Russ. The Lehman Russ is way less likely to die, way more likely to kill it, and is good into more than one kind of target. So this is a thing that you can do, but I'm going to recommend that you don't do it in your tournament games. If you want to play it in your casual narrative games, that's fine, but it's just not that effective. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about a little bit, and I made an entire video on this a while ago, is that especially if your Catachan mortars don't have targets, you should pivot what they're doing. So the classic examples for these are Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights, who have most of their armies being Armigers and War Dogs. But there are some other armies that just don't have anything worth shooting at. If your Catachan mortars don't have anything to shoot at and you don't need them to just screen out your backfield the entire time, don't do that with them. They're still infantry units that move fairly quickly and have Scout 6, which is one of the main sticking points of the Catachan Jungle Fighters. This unit still scouts 6 and moves 6 inches or 9 inches with move, 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 and it's still 6 OC or 9 OC if you give it duty and honor. Because they're on pretty big bases, they can screen out quite a bit. So don't get caught up in the idea of, oh, they're mortars, they have to be shooting indirectly the entire game. They don't have to do that. You can use them for a couple of different tools, and being able to pivot what you're actually trying to do with these units is one of the major ways that you can show skill expression with this unit. The next thing I want to talk about is the Krieg Heavy Flamers. Because on average, you want this unit to have about 2 2/3 activations. A Krieg Heavy Flamer will, on average, kill 1 Marine per Flamer activating. That's close to paying for itself in general. However, this is one of the best Overwatch tools that we have, especially if you're trying to kill Marine bodies. So if you can move your Krieg Flamers into position where they are going to shoot 1 target, but they can see a second target, such that if that second thing moves, you can overwatch it. Suddenly, you can get these Krieg Flamers to do a lot of damage to 1 unit of Marines, and then they can turn around and do the same thing to a second unit of Marines, or do even more to the first unit. Then, of course, if your opponent shoots it to death, which some armies kind of have to do, you can generally shoot 2 out of 3 of them a third time. Suddenly, killing 8 Marines with this unit is getting you about double your points back on average with this unit that is suddenly incredibly efficient. In order to get them into these positions, the general ways you're trying to do this are 1, you can move them on turn 1. 2, you can put them in a transport, especially in mechanized assault, in order to move them into position where they are doing a little bit more damage. Or 3, you can put them in reserves in order to come out off of one board edge, flame something there, and hopefully overwatch them if it ever chooses to move. Now, there is a little bit of rules nonsense that's going on with the Creek Flamer shooting on death, particularly when it comes to melee. And before I go too far with this, I want to make sure to tell you to check with your TO on this one because different TOs will rule this a little bit differently. However, there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. The first one is that attacks made in the 10th edition of 40k are not simultaneous. This is something that is a little bit of a holdover from previous editions, and it's an easy way to kind of shorthand some of the other things that we're saying. But if you take wounds on the heavy weapons team before the fire coordinator, you roll for each heavy weapons team when it dies on whether or not it shoots on death. That means that the heavy weapons teams will die before the fire coordinator, and the fire coordinator model will be on the battlefield when the heavy weapons team dies. Now, the next part of this is any model that is in engagement range cannot shoot, and you just remove it as normal. However, the other part of shoot on death says that you shoot on death before any other rules are resolved. This includes deadly demise, but more importantly, it also means it happens before your opponent consolidates their models. So this means if, for example, the fire coordinator is the only model that is in combat, when the fire coordinator dies and is taken off the board, suddenly your unit might no longer be locked in combat, and therefore everything that rolled at 3+ can shoot on death. This gives some weird gamey situations that you can actually do, especially if you're charging like large single model units. But the core thing to think about here is every model that is itself in engagement range when it dies cannot shoot on death, but if by killing those models, the remaining models are not in engagement range, then they're able to shoot on death. It's a little funky, but just think about if the individual model is not in engagement range, it will be eligible to shoot on death. I'll also go ahead and wrap this up by talking about the best detachments for heavy weapon squads. In general, mortars, Catachan mortars, like being in Bridgehead for the reroll ones to hit. This is just a 16% damage increase just across the board on account of rerolling ones. They also happen to fit very nicely with the way that Bridgehead wants to play, where it's controlling a lot of the board. And mortars are a cheap way to screen our side of the board, making sure we don't have to go backwards, while also providing a little bit of upside in clearing out our opponent's screen so that our scions are better able to take advantage of the parts of the board they're opening up. Creek Flamers are best in mechanized assault, where they have access to the mobility provided from transports, and also just +1 to wound, where they go from killing about 3 Marines to about 5 Marines. Creek Flamers are also decent in Hammer in particular, as a cheaper choice compared to Kazarkin, so if you need to save some points, Creek Flamers are a way to kill infantry more efficiently than something like Engineers or Catachan, that still have a lot of the other upsides of having these crazy Flamers just anywhere you want them on the board. Creek Flamers in general are also just okay in basically every detachment. So it'll mostly come down to what do you actually want them to do, and is the Overwatch threats that they're providing better than including like a Legionnaires battle tank or a Hellhound, or do you even have the points to get one of those other tools available? Overall though, this has been the Officer Training School about heavy weapon squads in general. Let me know down in the comments if there's anything else you think that I need to cover, and also what other episodes of Officer Training School you want to see coming up next. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Joshua Howard, and we'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.